In 1942, Douglas MacArthur sent a cable to Washington calling Jonathan Wainwright temporarily unbalanced. Wainwright had just surrendered the Philippines, the largest defeat in American military history, and MacArthur wanted the world to know he thought the man who replaced him had cracked. When George Marshall proposed giving Wainwright the Medal of Honor, MacArthur blocked it, personally, in writing. 3 years later, on the deck of the USS Missouri, MacArthur signed Japan's surrender with multiple pens. He turned in his chair and handed the first one to the man standing directly behind him. It was Wainwright, 62 years old, barely 130 pounds, skin like cracked leather, hair gone white. He'd spent 39 months in Japanese prison camps, convinced his own country considered him a disgrace. He didn't know he was a hero. He didn't know about the Medal of Honor fight. And the man handing him that pen was the same man who tried to bury him. Wainwright's last words from Corregidor had been addressed to President Roosevelt. He'd written, "Head bowed in sadness, but not in shame." He'd carried that word, shame, for over 1,000 days. If you find stories like this worth your time, take a moment to subscribe and hit the bell. We have much more coming for you. Your support is what keeps us moving forward. By May of 1942, Corregidor was already dying. The island fortress sat at the mouth of Manila Bay, 2 miles of concrete tunnels and rusting coastal guns, and it had been taking Japanese artillery fire for weeks. The water system was wrecked. The power generators were failing. Malinta Tunnel, the main headquarters, doubled as a hospital, and over 1,000 wounded lay inside it, stacked on cots in the tropical heat with no ventilation and almost no medicine. Wainwright had about 11,000 troops left on the island. Most of them hadn't eaten a full meal in months. A month earlier, it had been worse. Bataan, the peninsula across the bay, had held out since January with 72,000 American and Filipino soldiers slowly starving behind their own lines. The original plan, War Plan Orange, had always assumed a retreat to Bataan and Corregidor to hold Manila Bay until reinforcements arrived from the mainland. The reinforcements never came. No supply convoys made it through Japanese-controlled waters. The troops on Bataan were living on less than half rations by late January, and by April, they were eating anything they could catch. On April 8th, Major General Edward King looked at what was left of his force and made a decision Wainwright hadn't authorized. King surrendered Bataan on his own. It was the largest surrender of American troops since the Civil War. What came next? The force march north through the jungle that the world would come to know as the Bataan March was already underway while Wainwright watched from across the water. Now Wainwright was alone on Corregidor with the leftovers. He wasn't the kind of general who stayed in the tunnel. Before Bataan fell, Wainwright had earned the nickname Skinny for his gaunt 6-foot frame, and he'd earned a different reputation for something else entirely. He showed up on the front lines, jumped in and out of foxholes, fired back at the Japanese alongside enlisted men. The troops started calling him the last fighting general. On Corregidor, with nowhere left to retreat, Wainwright kept doing the same thing, walking the bombardment zones, checking gun positions, standing in the open while shells hit around him. His men saw him, and it mattered. The Japanese weren't patient about it. General Homma had a timeline. Manila Bay was a strategic priority, and Tokyo wanted it cleared. Starting in late April, Homma's artillery on the Bataan shore pounded Corregidor at a rate that turned the surface of the island into something unrecognizable. Trees were gone, buildings were gone, the beach defenses were rubble. On the night of May 5th, Japanese assault troops landed on the island's tail and started pushing toward Malinta Tunnel. Wainwright had one option left, and he knew exactly what it meant. If the Japanese reached the tunnel, they'd find 1,000 wounded who couldn't move. So on the morning of May 6, 1942, he sat down and dictated a radio message to President Roosevelt. The words were precise, with broken heart and head bowed in sadness, but not in shame. I report to Your Excellency that today I must arrange terms for the surrender of the fortified islands of Manila Bay. He asked the president to tell the nation that his men had done everything humanly possible. Then he added, "With profound regret and continued pride in my gallant troops, I go to meet the Japanese commander." It was 10:15 in the morning. He sent the message knowing it'd probably be the last transmission from Corregidor. And here's where it got worse. Wainwright walked out to meet the Japanese, expecting to surrender Corregidor. Just Corregidor, the 11,000 on the island, and nothing more. Homma's operations officer listened, then refused. The Japanese didn't want a peace. They wanted everything. Every American and Filipino soldier still holding out across the southern Philippines. Units Wainwright had limited contact with, forces under other commanders on islands hundreds of miles away. Homma's terms were absolute: surrender all of them, or the assault on Malinta Tunnel continues, and you're wounded, don't survive the next hour. Picture yourself in that position. You're standing in front of an enemy officer who's telling you that unless you give up forces, you can barely reach by radio. The men behind you, the ones who can't walk, are going to be overrun. There's no negotiation. There's no third option. You either sign a document that makes you responsible for the largest American military surrender in history, or you let a tunnel full of wounded men get butchered. Wainwright signed. He broadcast the surrender of all United States forces in the Philippines. Some commanders on the southern islands refused at first. A number of Filipino soldiers under Major General William Sharp's command ignored the order entirely and joined the guerrilla movement led by Colonel Wendell Fertig. Most complied. The total number of American and Filipino troops who went into Japanese captivity in the spring of 1942 exceeded 80,000. It was the worst military disaster in American history, and Jonathan Wainwright's name was at the bottom of the page. What followed was a scene the Japanese had choreographed for maximum humiliation. The defenders of Corregidor weren't marched north through Bataan. They were shipped across the bay to Manila and paraded through the city streets as a public display of Japanese superiority. Wainwright, the senior American general in the entire Pacific Theater, was forced to walk through the ranks of his own defeated men. They were broken, wounded, sick, hollow-eyed, uniforms hanging off them, some barely able to stand. And as Wainwright passed, they did something no one had ordered them to do. They got to their feet. Those who could stand, stood. Those who couldn't, tried. It was the last salute they'd give him for 3 years. There's something worth pausing on here. We tend to think of surrender as the opposite of courage. The man who gives up versus the man who fights to the end. But Wainwright's choice on Corregidor inverts that completely. Fighting to the end was the easier call. It would have meant his own death, which he'd already accepted, and the destruction of 1,000 helpless men in a tunnel, which he hadn't. The harder thing, the thing that would follow him into a cell and eat at him for over 1,000 nights, was to sign his name on a piece of paper and live with what it meant. Wainwright chose the version that cost him more, not his life, his name. And the first person to hold that against him was the man who'd left Corregidor 2 months before him. MacArthur was in Melbourne when the news arrived. He'd left Corregidor on the night of March 11th, 1942, aboard a PT boat commanded by Lieutenant John Bulkley under direct orders from President Roosevelt. The president didn't want the most senior American commander in the Pacific dead or captured. MacArthur hadn't wanted to go. He told his staff he intended to die on Corregidor, that he and his wife and his young son would go down with the garrison. Roosevelt overruled him, so on a dark night, with Japanese destroyers patrolling the waters south of Manila Bay, MacArthur climbed into one of 4 battered PT boats with his family and a handful of staff and ran for it. The crossing to Mindanao took 35 hours through heavy seas and enemy-held waters. From there, a pair of B-17 bombers flew MacArthur to Australia. He made his famous pledge on the platform at Adelaide, "I shall return." And then he watched from 1,200 miles away as the men he'd left behind ran out of everything. Now, 2 months later, Wainwright had surrendered all of it. MacArthur's reaction wasn't grief. It wasn't sympathy. He fired off a cable to the War Department in Washington, calling Wainwright temporarily unbalanced. In MacArthur's mind, he himself had resolved to fight to the end on Corregidor. The man he'd left in charge had failed to do the same. That Wainwright had been facing a force he couldn't stop, with no ammunition, no food, no water, and a tunnel full of men who couldn't walk. None of that entered MacArthur's calculation. The general who'd been ordered out before the worst of it came down hardest on the general who'd stayed for all of it. MacArthur went further. He He cabled his subordinate commanders in the southern Philippines and ordered them to disregard Wainwright's surrender. They didn't. And MacArthur didn't stop there. Here's the thing about MacArthur's own Medal of Honor. He'd received it in June of 1942, barely a month after Wainwright's surrender. It wasn't awarded for a specific act under fire. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, had proposed it as a countermeasure. Germany, Italy, and Japan were hammering MacArthur in their propaganda, calling him a coward, a deserter, the fleeing general. To neutralize that, Marshall recommended the nation's highest military honor. Roosevelt agreed. The award made MacArthur and his father, Arthur, the only father and son in American history to both hold the Medal of Honor. Whether it was fully earned or largely strategic, people disagreed then and disagree now. What matters for Wainwright is what happened next. On July 30th, 1942, Marshall proposed that Wainwright receive the same medal. The logic was clean. Wainwright had held Corregidor under impossible conditions. He'd personally exposed himself to fire on the front lines, walked bombardment zones his own staff begged him to avoid, and made the most painful decision a commander can make, surrendering his men to save them from annihilation. Marshall drafted a citation praising Wainwright's valor and resolution and sent it to MacArthur for a review. Standard procedure, a formality. MacArthur's response stunned the War Department. He didn't just raise a concern. He formally opposed the award in writing, with arguments that Secretary of War Henry Stimson would later judge untrue and untenable. MacArthur told Marshall that giving Wainwright the Medal of Honor would be, in his words, an injustice to unnamed generals who had exhibited powers of leadership and inspiration to a degree greatly superior to that of General Wainwright. He didn't name those superior generals. He didn't have to. Everyone reading the cable in Washington knew exactly who he meant. Marshall was stuck. He believed Wainwright deserved the medal. So did Stimson. But picking a public fight with MacArthur in the middle of 1942, when the Pacific War was going badly, and MacArthur was the most famous American general alive, wasn't a battle either man was willing to open. As Marshall later recalled, MacArthur's animosity toward Wainwright was tremendous, so Marshall quietly mothballed the nomination. He didn't destroy it. He put it in a drawer, noted the date, and waited. It would sit there for 3 years. So by the summer of 1942, this is what the ledger looked like. MacArthur, who'd left Corregidor under presidential orders before the final collapse, had his Medal of Honor. Wainwright, who'd stayed on Corregidor until the walls were literally falling in, didn't. MacArthur had publicly called Wainwright mentally unstable, ordered his subordinates to disobey him, and privately torpedoed his decoration. The man who'd been ordered to safety had passed judgment on the man who'd been left behind to face the worst. And if you think Wainwright at least knew what he was up against, that he understood the political landscape and could prepare himself, here's the part that makes it worse. He had no idea. None of it reached him. Wainwright didn't know about the temporarily unbalanced cable. He didn't know about the Medal of Honor nomination or MacArthur's written opposition. He didn't know that the commander he still respected, the man whose strategy he tried to execute until the ammunition ran dry, had turned against him from the safety of Melbourne. All Wainwright knew, sitting in a Japanese holding facility on Luzon in the summer of 1942, was the weight of his own name on that surrender document. He went over the decision constantly, replayed it in his head night after night. Was there another way? Could Corregidor have held another week? Should he have refused Homma's terms and let the assault on Malinta Tunnel go forward? He didn't have answers. He had the question, and the question was the only thing in that cell that never left him alone. What made Wainwright's guilt so corrosive wasn't that it was baseless. It was that the one man whose opinion would have mattered most to him had, in fact, confirmed his worst fear, and Wainwright didn't even know it. MacArthur had looked at what happened on Corregidor and called it a breakdown. The verdict was already written. The accused just hadn't been told. And that gets at something about how the military world works. Honor in that world isn't a feeling you carry around. It's a currency. It determines whether you're promoted, whether your peers look you in the eye, whether the history books file you under leadership or failure. Wainwright had spent 40 years earning that currency, frontline combat, 3 generations of military service in his family, a reputation for personal courage that few generals in any army could match. On one morning in Corregidor, he believed he'd spent it all. What he couldn't know was that the one man with the authority to restore it had already refused to do so. Marshall's nomination sat in a drawer in Washington. MacArthur's objection sat on top of it. And the man it was all about sat in a cell on Luzon, prosecuting himself for a crime that half of Washington had already forgiven. The first camp was a converted barracks in Tarlac on the northern plains of Luzon. Wainwright and a group of senior officers were held there through the summer of 1942, living on rice and water. The Japanese didn't give their highest-ranking prisoner any special treatment. The nickname Skinny had been a joke before the war. Now it was becoming a medical condition. By fall, things got worse. When American Marines landed on Guadalcanal, Tokyo decided their most valuable prisoner needed to be moved farther from any potential rescue. Wainwright was transferred to Corenco, a camp on the east coast of Formosa. Other senior Allied officers were already there, British, Dutch, American, including Major General William Sharp, whose troops Wainwright had been forced to surrender by radio from Corregidor. The men who'd obeyed that order and the man who'd given it were now sharing the same starvation rations in the same compound. The treatment at Corenco devolved fast. Starvation was systematic. Japanese guards withheld International Red Cross supplies that had actually been delivered to the camp, food packages, medicine, basic necessities, and locked them in storage for 3.5 years. The prisoners didn't know those supplies existed. They survived on whatever the guards decided to hand out, which was almost nothing. Beatings were routine, infractions that wouldn't register in any Western military, failing to bow at the right angle, moving too slowly, looking a guard in the eye, could mean hours of punishment. One prisoner at the nearby Mukden camp was ordered to do 100 push-ups. Each time he pushed up, a guard struck him on the head with a rifle butt. His arms were useless for days afterward. Wainwright endured the same conditions as everyone else. His rank bought him nothing. If anything, the Japanese treated his status as a reason to make an example. They'd captured the highest-ranking American officer in the entire Pacific Theater, and they intended to demonstrate what surrender looked like from the losing side. Wainwright's weight dropped steadily through 1942 and into 43. His hair, dark when he'd entered captivity, went white. His skin cracked and aged. The man who'd once been a lean, tough cavalry officer started looking 20 years older than he was, and through all of it, there was the silence. This is the part that's hard to grasp from the outside. The physical suffering was constant. The beatings, the hunger, the tropical heat on Formosa, and later, the brutal cold of Manchuria. But the information blackout was its own kind of destruction. Wainwright had almost no contact with the outside world. He didn't know who was winning the war. He didn't know whether the United States had recovered from the disasters of 42. He didn't know whether anyone at home remembered him, and if they did, whether they remembered a leader or a disgrace. The only version of Jonathan Wainwright that he had access to was the one inside his own head, the general who'd signed the largest American military surrender in history. And that version got louder every month. He kept a diary. In it, Wainwright went back to the morning of May 6th over and over. He re-examined every variable: the ammunition count, the water supply, the wounded in Malinta Tunnel, Homma's ultimatum. He weighed each factor, found no alternative, and then started the whole calculation again the next day. His weight, which he also tracked in those pages, kept falling. The two records, the endless relitigation of his decision and the steady disappearance of his body, ran side by side in the same notebook. What Wainwright couldn't see was what was happening on the other side of the Pacific. Americans hadn't forgotten him. They turned him into something close to a national symbol. The press had given the siege of Corregidor enormous coverage, and Wainwright's stand, the general who'd stayed behind when MacArthur left, who'd walked the front lines under fire, who'd held out until there was nothing left, had made him one of the most admired military figures of the early war. In May of 1944, Time magazine put Wainwright on its cover. The image showed his face behind barbed wire. 2 years into his captivity, he was more famous in the United States than most of the generals who were actually winning battles. He had no way of knowing any of this. And if you stop and think about what that does to a person, it's worse than the beatings. You're sitting in a camp on Formosa and later in Manchuria, where the winters hit 40 below and the buildings aren't heated. You're convinced your country has written you off. You believe you'll face a court-martial when the war ends, if you survive it. Every morning you wake up and the first thing in your head is that document you signed on Corregidor and the 80,000 men who went into captivity because your name was at the bottom. And somewhere on the other side of the ocean, millions of people consider you a hero, and a Medal of Honor with your name on it is sitting in a desk drawer in Washington because one man won't sign off on it. You don't know, you just know the cell and the rice and the question that never stops. By late 1944, the Japanese moved Wainwright again. As American B-29 bombers came within striking range of the home islands, Tokyo relocated its high-value prisoners deeper into the mainland. Wainwright and 33 other senior Allied officers, including the British General Arthur Percival, who'd surrendered Singapore, were transferred to a camp at Shan, a desolate compound in the frozen interior of Manchuria. Conditions were the worst yet. The cold was savage, food was scarcer than it had been anywhere else, and the blackout held. The prisoners in Manchuria didn't learn about D-Day. They didn't learn about the liberation of the Philippines. They didn't learn that MacArthur had waded ashore at Leyte and made good on his promise to return. They waited. For months in the cold, with nothing to do and nothing to know, they waited. Wainwright had entered Japanese captivity at the age of 58, a lean, physically hard career soldier with 3 generations of military service behind his name. By the summer of 1945, he was 62. 39 months of starvation, isolation, and brutality had stripped him down to something his own staff wouldn't have recognized. The Japanese artillery on Corregidor hadn't broken Jonathan Wainwright. The camps had taken everything off him, except the one thing he couldn't put down: the guilt. On August 15, 1945, the Emperor of Japan went on the radio and told his people the war was over. The broadcast reached most of the world within hours. It didn't reach the camp at Shan. The prisoners in Manchuria found out days later, when the Japanese guard started acting differently. The routine beating stopped. The food rations ticked up slightly. No one explained why. Then, on August 16th, an OSS team under the command of Major Robert Hennessy parachuted into Manchuria as part of Operation Cardinal, one of several mercy missions designed to locate and recover Allied prisoners before the Soviet Red Army, which was already pushing through Manchuria from the north, could reach the camps first. A smaller team, Major Robert Lamar and Sergeant Harold Leith, was dispatched specifically to find the senior officers at Shan. When Lamar and Leith arrived at the compound, the scene they found was hard to process. These were supposed to be generals, flag officers from the United States, Great Britain, the Netherlands. The men standing in front of them looked like refugees, gaunt, frail, dressed in threadbare clothing, blinking at the light as if they hadn't been outside in weeks. The most senior of them, the one the entire mission had been built around, was almost unrecognizable. Wainwright was 62, weighed barely 130 pounds, and leaned on a cane. His hair was completely white. His face was hollowed out, the cheekbones sharp, the eyes sunken deep. Wainwright stared at the 2 Americans in clean uniforms. His first words were cautious. "Are you really Americans?" They confirmed it. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Wainwright and the other prisoners were going home. And then Wainwright asked the question he'd been carrying for 39 months. He didn't ask about the war. He didn't ask about his family. He asked, "What do the people in the States think of me?" That one sentence tells you everything about what 3 years of silence had done to him. Wainwright wasn't asking out of vanity. He was asking because he genuinely believed the answer might be that America considered him a coward, that the surrender of the Philippines had erased everything else. He was bracing for a verdict he'd been rehearsing in his own head since the morning he'd signed that document on Corregidor. Lamar told him the truth. Wainwright was a national hero. The American public considered him one of the bravest men in the war. People at home had followed his capture, mourned it, and were waiting for him to come back. Wainwright listened, and he didn't believe it. Not immediately. The idea that the country he'd assumed had written him off had actually been pulling for him for 3 years was too large to absorb standing in a prison compound in Manchuria. He nodded and held himself together. He would later write that the news felt like something happening to a different person. On August 24th, Soviet troops formally liberated the camp. Within days, Wainwright was flown out of Manchuria, through Chongqing, and on to the Philippines. His final destination was Yokohama, Japan, where MacArthur had set up his headquarters in advance of the formal surrender ceremony on September 2nd. The reunion happened on August 31st at the new Grand Hotel. MacArthur was eating dinner with several staff officers when an aide walked in and told him Wainwright had arrived at the hotel. MacArthur's reaction was immediate. He pushed back from the table, stood up, and said, "Show him in at once." The door opened, and what walked through it wasn't the Jonathan Wainwright that MacArthur remembered from Corregidor. A thin, stooped figure leaned heavily on a cane, wearing a uniform that hung off his frame like it had been cut for someone 2 sizes larger. Wainwright's wrists were bones. His collar gaped around a neck that had shrunk to half its former size. MacArthur later wrote in his memoir that Wainwright's skin looked like old shoe leather, that his hair had gone snow white, and that his eyes had a fierce, almost tortured intensity to them. MacArthur crossed the room and grabbed him. He wrapped his arms around the man he'd left on Corregidor 3.5 years earlier, and his voice cracked. "Jim, Jim," that was all he could get out at first. Wainwright managed one word, "General." Then his composure gave way entirely. He wept. Here's the thing that makes this moment so difficult to read cleanly. MacArthur's emotion was real. Multiple officers present in that room confirmed it. The embrace happened. The tears happened. MacArthur was shaken by what captivity had done to Wainwright. And at the same time, this was the same man who'd called Wainwright temporarily unbalanced 3 years earlier. The same man who'd blocked his Medal of Honor in writing. The same man who tried to order subordinate commanders to disobey Wainwright's surrender. Nothing in the historical record explains how MacArthur moved from one position to the other. There's no letter, no diary entry, no recorded conversation with a staff officer where MacArthur admitted he'd been wrong about Corregidor. What there is this. MacArthur told Wainwright he wanted him to stand directly behind him at the surrender ceremony on the Missouri, the most visible position on the most consequential stage of the 20th century. Whatever MacArthur had felt in 1942, by the last day of August 1945, he'd decided something else. Whether that shift came from guilt or political instinct or genuine recognition of what Wainwright had endured, or all of those things tangled together, MacArthur never said. He just gave the order. Wainwright accepted. He was still absorbing the reunion, still processing the news that he wasn't a disgrace, still adjusting to the physical reality of standing in a room with electric lights and real food. He didn't know about the Medal of Honor nomination sitting in Washington. He didn't know MacArthur had blocked it. He didn't know that George Marshall had already pulled that 3-year-old paperwork out of the drawer and sent it to Secretary Stimson with a message that amounted to one word, now. All Wainwright knew was that the man he'd served under, the man whose opinion had haunted him through 39 months of captivity, wanted him there on the deck of the Missouri. For a man who'd spent over 1,000 days convinced he'd never be allowed to wear his uniform with honor again, that was enough. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay. The USS Missouri sat at anchor surrounded by more than 250 Allied warships, battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, stretched across the bay in every direction. Above them, wave after wave of American aircraft flew in formation. So many that the drone of their engines was continuous, a low roar that didn't let up for the entire ceremony. The whole thing was being broadcast live by radio to every corner of the world. MacArthur had staged the setting with the precision of a theater director. 2 flags hung on the bulkhead behind the signing table. One was the American flag that had been flying over the Capitol building in Washington on December 7, 1941, the morning of Pearl Harbor. The other was far older. It was the flag that Commodore Matthew Perry had carried into this same bay 92 years earlier, in 1853, when Perry forced Japan to open its ports to the west for the first time. MacArthur had requested it personally. It had been flown from the Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis under armed guard. Every object on that deck was a message, and MacArthur had written every one of them. The Japanese delegation arrived by boat just before 9 in the morning. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, in a top hat and morning coat, limped up the gangway on a wooden leg he'd lost to a bombing in Shanghai years earlier. Behind him came General Yoshijiro Umezu, the Army Chief of Staff who'd opposed the surrender and had to be directly ordered by the Emperor to attend. The two men stepped onto the deck of the Missouri and faced a table covered in green felt, with the instruments of surrender laid out in 2 copies. Behind that table stood MacArthur, and directly behind MacArthur, in the most visible position on that entire deck, stood 2 men. On MacArthur's right was Jonathan Wainwright. On his left was Arthur Percival, the British general who'd surrendered Singapore in February of 1942. 2 men who'd spent the war in Japanese prison camps. 2 men whose countries had spent years debating whether they were courageous or broken. MacArthur had placed them exactly where every camera, every diplomat, and every flag officer in Tokyo Bay would see them first. Wainwright was wearing a uniform that had been hastily tailored in Yokohama to fit his shrunken frame. It still didn't sit right. The collar gaped, the shoulders sagged. He weighed under 130 pounds and looked like he'd aged 15 years in 3. He stood straight. He kept his hands at his sides. And if you looked at the photographs from that morning, what you'd see in Wainwright's face isn't relief, and it isn't triumph. It's a man holding himself together through pure discipline, standing on the most important stage of the century on legs that barely had the muscle to keep him upright. MacArthur stepped to the microphone. His opening words were brief. He said the issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies had been determined on the battlefields of the world, and hence were not for discussion or debate. He invited the Japanese representatives to sign. Shigemitsu sat down at the table, fumbled with the documents for a moment, uncertain which copy to sign and where. MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland, leaned over and pointed to the correct line. Shigemitsu signed. Umezu followed, barely looking at the paper, his face locked in rigid contempt. Then it was MacArthur's turn. He sat down and picked up a pen. He didn't sign his name in a single stroke. He used multiple pens, switching partway through, because each pen was going somewhere specific. Every one of them was a gift, and the order mattered. MacArthur wrote the first few characters of his signature. Then he stopped. He put down the pen, turned in his chair, and reached past the officers standing closest to him. He handed the pen directly to Wainwright, the man who'd called Wainwright temporarily unbalanced, the man who'd blocked his Medal of Honor, the man who treated the surrender of the Philippines as a personal betrayal for 3 years. That man turned around on the most watched stage on earth and gave the first pen to the general he'd tried to erase. Wainwright took it. His hand was steady. He didn't speak. MacArthur picked up the next pen, signed a few more letters, and handed it to Percival. The third pen went to Sutherland. Others went to the National Archives, to West Point. The full signature spread across all those pens took less than a minute. The ceremony, start to finish, lasted 23 minutes. No speech from Wainwright afterward. No public reconciliation. No handshake for the cameras where MacArthur looked him in the eye and said he'd been wrong. The pen was the statement. In front of every officer and every diplomat and every camera crew packed onto that deck, MacArthur had chosen to make the first gesture of victory, a gesture aimed at the man whose defeat had haunted him, or burdened his conscience, or complicated his legacy for 3.5 years. The pen did what MacArthur never did out loud. It said, "You weren't a disgrace. You were the first person I thought of when this was over." Whether Wainwright fully understood all of that in the moment is something no record can answer. He stood on the deck of the Missouri for the rest of the ceremony. He watched the flyover. He held the pen. And for the first time since that morning on Corregidor, the word shame wasn't the heaviest thing he was carrying. 8 days after the Missouri, Wainwright was standing in the Rose Garden of the White House. He didn't know why he was there. President Truman had invited him to Washington, and Wainwright had assumed it was a courtesy call, a handshake, and a photograph with the new commander-in-chief. Truman met him on the lawn, looked at the gaunt figure in front of him, and said, "Take it easy, General. We don't want to fatigue you." Wainwright straightened. "I'm pretty tough," he answered. or "I wouldn't be here." Then Truman pulled out a small blue case and opened it. Inside was the Medal of Honor. Wainwright hadn't been told. He didn't know the nomination existed. He didn't know George Marshall had first proposed it in the summer of 1942, 3 years and 2 months earlier, or that MacArthur had blocked it in writing, or that Marshall had pulled the paperwork out of a drawer the moment Japan surrendered and sent it to Secretary of War Stimson with instructions to reconsider immediately. Stimson had reviewed MacArthur's original objections line by line. His conclusion was 2 words: untrue and untenable. The medal was approved. General Order No. 80, dated September 10, 1945. Jonathan Wainwright became the first 4-star general in American history to receive it. He stood in the Rose Garden with the medal around his neck, and for the second time in 10 days, he couldn't hold back the tears. So think about where this man had been just 3 weeks earlier, sitting in a frozen compound in Manchuria, weighing 130 pounds, convinced his country wanted to court-martial him. Now he was standing in the White House garden. The President of the United States was pinning the nation's highest military honor on his chest, and the objections that had kept it from him for 3 years had been officially declared baseless. The distance between those 2 moments, 21 days, was shorter than any single stretch Wainwright had spent in a punishment cell. 3 days after the ceremony, on September 13th, New York City gave him a ticker-tape parade. The crowds lined the streets of Lower Manhattan for miles. The man who'd spent 39 months convinced he'd be remembered as a disgrace was driven through the city in an open car, while strangers cheered his name and waved American flags from office windows. It was the largest ticker-tape parade New York had seen since Lindbergh's. Wainwright published his memoir the following year. He titled it General Wainwright's Story, and the subtitle didn't flinch: 4 years of defeat, surrender, and captivity. He kept nothing back. So here's where the line closes. On the morning of May 6, 1942, Wainwright had sat down in Malinta Tunnel and dictated his last message from Corregidor. He'd ended it with a phrase he'd chosen carefully, head bowed in sadness, but not in shame. That word, shame, was the one he couldn't put down. He'd carried it through 4 prison camps, across 2 oceans, and through 39 months of total silence. MacArthur had reinforced it from the other side of the world without Wainwright ever knowing, calling him unbalanced, blocking his medal, treating his decision on Corregidor as a mark against the entire command. And then, on September 2, 1945, MacArthur picked up a pen on the deck of the Missouri, signed the first few letters of his name, and handed it to the man standing behind him. Not to a staff officer, not to a museum, to Wainwright. The word shame had followed Jonathan Wainwright for 1,215 days. It took MacArthur less than a minute to cross it out. Sometimes the hand that erases the stain is the same hand that put it there. That isn't redemption in any clean sense. MacArthur never apologized. He never admitted he'd been wrong about Corregidor. He never acknowledged that his opposition to the Medal of Honor had been, in his own Secretary of War's words, baseless. What he did was turn in his chair and hand a pen to the man he'd condemned. Whether that gesture came from guilt or political instinct or something MacArthur himself couldn't have named, he never said. And maybe it doesn't matter, because the man who received the pen never demanded an explanation. Wainwright never publicly criticized MacArthur, not in his memoir, not in interviews, not in the years that followed when he had every reason to settle the account. He returned to active duty, took command of the 4th Army at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, and lived quietly. He answered letters from families of men who hadn't come home from the Philippines. He attended reunions with the survivors of Corregidor and the camps. He didn't talk about what had been done to him in Washington while he'd been sitting in a cell on the other side of the world. On September 2, 1953, exactly 8 years to the day after the surrender ceremony on the deck of the Missouri, Jonathan Wainwright suffered a stroke at Fort Sam Houston. He was 70 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The citation on his Medal of Honor praised his intrepid leadership and unyielding courage under fire. Henry Stimson's ruling on the objections that had kept it from him for 3 years remained in the War Department archives. 2 words: untrue, untenable,